The next process in the fabrication process is to use another drill bit from the suction socket fabrication tooling in order to bore out the center hole so that we can insert our extraction drive bolt later on. You want to ensure that the center hole is completely free of debris so that the extraction bolt can be inserted in. But first we have to cut the trim line. Once the trim line is properly cut, we'll use the drive bolt from the foam extraction tooling kit to thread into the separating plate. You want to hand thread into the separating plate until you can feel it engage, and then either use an air ratchet or manual ratchet in order to drive the bolt completely in. And there you have the socket extracted from the foam. Once the socket is extracted, we'll use the European 4-hole drill guide from the SSFT kit in order to drill our 4-hole pattern. Once the 4-hole pattern's drilled, we'll use the distal end surfacing tool in order to flatten off the distal end of the socket. It is important that the distal end of the socket is completely flush and flat, and so that there are parallel surfaces inside and outside the distal end of the socket surface. This is important to prevent any lock binding and to create flat and even sealing surfaces for the lock. Next, we're going to use the side hole fixture from the SSFT kit in order to drill our side hole. It is imperative that you use this fixture so that the side hole gets drilled in the proper orientation and level on the cylindrical void for the socket so that all the sealing points are met in the socket. Once the side hole is drilled through, the socket can be removed from the fixture and you can deburr it. and get ready for installation of the lock. Once the socket has been extracted and the trim line's been cleaned up and holes deburred, it's time for installation of the lock. Since the EVLS lock is press fit sealed down into the distal end of the socket, it may be necessary to use a little bit of lubricant. What we suggest is water-soluble lubricant. You don't need a whole lot. Just rub it along the outside edge of the lock. The lock should be installed in a typical manner. If you've had good vacuum and you've got a good quality fabricated socket, the lock should be fairly snug and press fit down in the distal end of the socket. The next step is to install the manifold and the distal connector. Which brings up a very important point. When you are installing the bolts into your EVLS system, the bolts that are going into the distal end of the socket, such as you see from the bottom of the manifold to the end of the bolt, cannot be any longer than 24 millimeters, but they have to be at least 18 millimeters. So it's a good idea to do a quick check of your bolt length. And we have 19 millimeters here, so we're okay. If you use too long of bolts, they thread in through the distal end of the lock and push the urethane cushion up, and it could affect the sealability of your socket. Once the bolts are installed, it's recommended that you tighten each of the bolts in the 4-hole pattern to 10 Newton meters using a torque wrench. Once that's been accomplished, then the socket is ready to be tested under vacuum and your EVLS fitting can begin.